Amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, diabetes already, and it's interesting to contemplate the two diseases as far as like treatment goes, because it seems like, we were using food. We found out that food worked really well. Ketogenic diets work really well. Then pharma came along. We invented things like medications you've already mentioned for diabetes. We found insulin. We made insulin. We were able to
Right.
provide insulin, and it becomes kind of this thing like Gary Taubes writes about in Reversing Diabetes. Well, it's like, well, it's kind of hard to eat this way when we can just give you this injection and you'll, maybe have the same effect. And now you don't have to do this diet that's a little bit hard to comply to. You can eat like everybody else.
That's sort of what it's about. Yeah. Be like everyone else, eat like everyone else. However, you're going to get sick, you know, at a young age and die much sooner than everyone else because your insulin levels are high all the time, and that's really, really bad for the body.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
We kind of took a deep dive into your personal story last time, but if you could just remind us how you were interested in psychiatry to begin with, how you were trained and how you were taught to practice, and then how you were introduced to different ideas about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can give the shorter version this time. If people want the full version, they can maybe go back and listen to the other episode. But yeah, I mean, I was a traditional psychiatrist. I was interested in it for many reasons, but I thought it would always, it was a challenging field. And I had a couple of personal interactions with people with severe mental illness when I was younger. And so I felt like this was really, my place in medicine. I did this very traditional training program, learned all the medications, learned various forms of psychotherapy, and was practicing all of that. And then, about 8.5 years ago, my two of my three sons got very sick with what we later figured out was autoimmune encephalitis, very bad autoimmune immune cells attacking the brain, causing runaway inflammation in the brain. It looked very psychiatric at first. None of the psychiatric treatments helped whatsoever. And we went down this long road of functional and integrative medicine, environmental medicine, eventually figured out they had infections from Lyme, tick-borne illnesses. They had exposure to mold. We did a huge amount of treatment to reverse all of that. And it really made me start thinking, how many of the people that I care for, also who are not getting better, and that's unfortunately a big part of any psychiatrist's practice is not getting better from traditional treatments. How many of them had something going on in their body, that was causing what we thought to be, a chemical imbalance in their brain and really did a very deep dive into all of this and luckily was introduced to the work of Chris Palmer early on in this, probably about 8 years ago, and realized the power that food has. And of all the things that I learned in that huge journey in functional environmental medicine, the most powerful thing that I learned about in terms of helping people with mental health problems is metabolic improvement, and especially the ketogenic diet. There's a whole other piece of the program. There's more pieces of the program than just that. The ketogenic diet itself is very powerful. I like people to do more than just that, and we can talk about that. But that is the most powerful part of the program.
And it doesn't sound like second place is even that close.
Yeah, well, I mean, exercise is really good too. Yeah, exercise is excellent for the brain. It's actually, in head-to-head studies, not really head-to-head studies, but if you look at all the studies that look at exercise for depression and all the studies that look at modern antidepressants for depression, the effect size for exercise is actually quite a bit higher than antidepressants. People always say, "Oh, well, then exercise works better than antidepressants." Well, that's true if you can get people to exercise. And if people know someone who's severely depressed, it's often impossible for them to exercise, actually. So it's not actually a thing that people can just pull off the shelf and say, "Here's your answer, just exercise." It doesn't usually work that way. But once people are in ketosis and they're starting to feel a little better, we usually can get people exercising, and it really, those things are synergistic, the ketogenic diet and exercise, as you know, for metabolism, but also for brain health. They're very synergistic interventions.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
And tell us, as a traditional psychiatrist, what tools do you have available to you? Obviously, you got some medications, some treatments. Like what things can you do to help? Like what were you trained in?
Yeah, so medications of various kinds, psychotherapy, various forms of psychotherapy, which I've practiced my entire career. So from psychodynamic therapy to cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy. I'm trained in something called open dialogue for people with psychotic illnesses, which is really cool and interesting. All, and something called mentalization based therapy. So, those are all the therapies that I use. There are more, of course. I'm not saying I know all the different psychotherapies. And then, there are things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is an interesting treatment that is getting a lot of interest these days because they're coming out with new forms of TMS that are accelerated and it seem to be more effective. And that's a pretty safe treatment. So, I do think it's an option for some people. There's now, ketamine therapy, which is also pretty interesting, and at some point probably other psychedelic medications will come out. I think that's a really interesting part of the future of mental health and psychiatry. So those are some of the different things. But like I said, I think out of all of those things, the thing that I'm most excited about by far is the results I'm seeing with ketogenic diets because it's so powerful, but also once people feel well and if they can continue doing it, with which I see many people doing, and this is another criticism sometimes people have is, oh, people can't sustain that. Well, we know different. People can, everyone can, including people with severe mental health disorders. I've seen it happen over and over again. But they can keep sustaining it, and their mental health keeps getting better month after month after month. That does not happen with any of these other treatments, except maybe really, really good psychotherapy that's really, really working for somebody. But otherwise, you just don't see other, medications. People don't keep getting better month after month after month. TMS, you have your course and then it stops. Psychedelics, you might get a great bit of relief, but again, are you going to keep doing psychedelics over and over again? Probably not, and it may not be a good idea. Whereas this is safe, it's good for the body, and people keep improving over time, which is just amazing to see.
That's so cool. As far as you can remember, take us back to the moment that you came across the work of Chris Palmer, and he was, whether it was a presentation at a conference or whatever it was, like take us back to, related to what we talked about earlier. Like if somebody's trying to convince you that this is a thing, and it sounds too good to be true. Like, what was your mindset as you were, in the situation listening to Chris Palmer for the first time?
Yeah, well, of course, this is back in 2018, I think, and I was at a grand rounds at McLean Hospital. It's this, old psychiatric hospital. There's this, really old conference room, or like it's not even, it's bigger than a conference room. It's like a lecture hall, basically, with wood panels, and it's an old building. And he's giving this lecture, and at the time, of course, there was a lot less information. He was really at the forefront of this. So, I mean, he had a few case reports that were published, and he was talking about the epilepsy literature, and he was explaining sort of what it is and how it works a bit. And, I would say there are probably, 150 or 200 people in the room, all these, psychiatrists and psychologists at McLean and social workers. Um, if I had to guess, I would say I might have been the only person in the room that truly believed what he was telling us. I mean, I just feel like people listened and they just said, "Whoa, what was that?" and just sort of walked out of the room. But meanwhile, my kids were already sick. My mind was already blown that modern psychiatry does not have all the answers and modern medicine doesn't have all the answers. So I was completely receptive, and I was super excited about what I was hearing. I couldn't. He was talking about reversing, lifelong schizophrenia that had been non-responsive to the most powerful medications with the ketogenic diet, and he had a rationale and was talking about real science that really made sense. And I was blown away at that point.
I
Yeah.
was going to ask you how many converts were in that room. You were the only one that got converted from what you could tell.
As far as I can tell, I might have been the only one. I've asked Chris about that. He said, "Yeah, yeah, that might be true."
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so sad. It's such a bummer. Oh man. Okay, well, I
Well, there's a
I
lot more converts now, though. I mean, that's
that's
the
true.
thing. That was a long time ago. There's a lot more data that's come out. Even since we talked a year ago, there's more data that's come out, which we can talk a little bit about. The science is just getting stronger and stronger. And also, these stories are just getting more and more of people who are telling their own story about putting what they were told is a lifelong, debilitating disabling condition into remission with this diet. And those stories are just, people are starting to listen and really understand that, like, people can't be making this up. This is really what's happening.